Well, hi everyone. I'm counting only 3 commissioners so far, including myself.
I notice Commissioner Podar is in there as a participant, so she needs to be voted to a panelist.
So Commissioner, oh, here she is.
Hi.
Oh, sure.
And Commissioner Bidu is not attending tonight, correct?
That's correct.
There's Jeff. All right, let's get started. Good evening, everyone. I'm Deborah Lockwood, Chair of the Washington County Planning Commission. Today is February 16th, 2022, and tonight's Planning Commission meeting is called to order. Ms. Aguilar, would you please call the roll?
Yes, I can. As we said, Commissioner Bidu is absent. Commissioner Havner?
Present.
Commissioner Milliman?
Present.
Commissioner Petrillo?
Yes, present.
Commissioner Podar?
Present, and I use she, her pronouns.
Commissioner Wellner?
Present.
Commissioner Will?
Present.
Vice Chair Dye? Looks like he is not with us right now.
Not yet.
Okay. And Chair Lockwood?
Present. All right, let's begin with our director's report. Mr. Back.
Thank you. First want to let you know on March 1st, the board will be deliberating about Ordinance 882, which is the tile flat ordinance. So we will let you know on the 2nd what they did on the 1st. So tonight we have 2 ordinances, 886 and 885. 886 has to do with the comprehensive framework plan for middle housing, and 885 has to do with the community development code for middle housing. We anticipate that you'll continue to the 2nd of March, where we'll likely have 2 more hearings unless you act on one of the ordinances tonight. And then we anticipate having another meeting the 16th of February on both or one of the ordinances, depending on what you do. We have tentatively scheduled March 30th for a special meeting. So at some point tonight, getting some sort of feel from you whether a night meeting or day meeting is preferred. Might be good for scheduling purposes as we go down the road here. You may be done on the 16th of March and not need it, but we just want to make sure that you can act before the board's first meeting at that first Tuesday in April. I do want to mention things could be a little bit different in terms of getting information from staff over the next month because of how we're anticipating that we'll have a lot of information. You'll have questions. We'll try to get everything into the staff reports so you have plenty of time to consider the information. But we also recognize that if we have the information and the staff report's already been issued, it's better to get that information to you prior to your meeting than showing up with the meeting. So just know that there could be a couple instances where you get information out of sequence. We want to make sure that you get it as soon as we're in a good position to provide it. So hopefully you'll bear with us over the next month, just knowing that it's going to be a little fast and furious, more so than normal in terms of getting information to you. With that, I don't have any more information to share.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Beck? Okay, thank you. I don't see any, so we'll go to our next item, which is oral communications. Do we have anybody signed up for oral communications?
No, we don't tonight.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So we can move to our public hearings on ordinances 886 first and then 885. And I just wanted to make a brief comment at the beginning. We'll probably have a lot to ask and a lot to discuss about both of these. And so I'm just asking that during the staff presentation, please just ask your brief questions and then save your more involved questions and comments for the discussion that will come later with the whole commission. And with that, may we have our presentation on ordinance 886.
Yes, thank you, Chair Lockwood and Commissioners. I'm Suzanne Savin, Senior Planner with Community Planning with Ordinance 886, Comprehensive Framework Plan Amendments. Next slide, please. So this ordinance amends the Comprehensive Framework Plan for the urban area called the CFP, and it proposes changes to specific policies, implementing strategies, and summary findings and conclusions in the CFP. The amendments implement the state law changes in House Bill 2001, the Middle Housing Bill, and the changes align county policy with new middle housing requirements, reflect current conditions, and add references to middle housing. Next slide. So as background, in 2019, the state adopted House Bill 2001, the Middle Housing Bill, and middle housing is the range of housing types between traditional single detached houses and multi-family residential buildings. It includes duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and/or cottage clusters. And the intent of the bill is to encourage a more diverse mix of housing, increase housing options for those who cannot afford a detached home, and provide owners with opportunities to redevelop property. Next slide, please. This ordinance amends the Comprehensive Framework Plan for the urban area to implement changes adopted in House Bill 2001. The CFP is the source document that establishes the policies of countywide concern for the urban unincorporated area. So it's got 44 broad policies, and they are foundational for future growth and development in the urban area. They include implementing strategies that form the basis of other comprehensive plan amendments, including the Community Development Code. Next slide. So the ordinance proposes to amend 6 comprehensive framework plan policies that address plan designations, infill, housing affordability, housing choice and availability, housing discrimination, and regional planning implementation. And the proposed amendments would implement state law changes adopted in House Bill 2001, and better align county policies with the new middle housing requirements, and they would also add references to middle housing. The amendments would also improve information accuracy and better reflect current conditions. Several of these policies have not been substantially amended since the 1980s, and they contain outdated information, and so they've been updated for clarity and accuracy. So this ordinance is one of 2 ordinances filed to address the HB 2001 requirements. The other ordinance is Ordinance 885, which proposes to amend the Community Development Code, and that will be addressed in a separate presentation. Next slide, please. So the proposed amendments for CFP Policy 18, plan designations, and locational criteria for development. This policy requires the county to prepare community plans and development regulations that correspond with the plan designations and locational criteria. And so the amendments consist of amending the plan designation descriptions to add references to middle housing and improve the clarity and accuracy of the descriptions. Next slide, please. CFP Policy 19 is infill, and this policy addresses development of vacant or underdeveloped R5 and R6 lands of 2 acres or less. The intent of the policy was to buffer existing residences from adjacent development, and the amendments clarify that middle housing is not subject to the development regulations associated with the infill policy. And this is because House Bill 2001 allows only limited siting and design standards to be applied to middle housing, and infill provisions are not included in those limited siting and design standards allowed by the House bill, so they may not be applied to middle housing. Next slide, please. CFP Policy 21, housing affordability, encourages the housing industry to provide housing affordable to a range of households. And the ordinance amendments include updating descriptions of housing affordability programs and the role of county departments in housing affordability, and adding references to middle housing as a way to accommodate more variety in the housing type and sale or rental price. Next slide, please. CFP Policy 22, housing choice and availability. This policy encourages the housing industry to provide a variety of housing in sufficient quantities, and the ordinance amendments include adding a reference to middle housing as a strategy for providing housing variety, and updating the description of the American household to include more recent trends, and adding a description of House Bill 2001. CFP Policy 40, regional planning implementation, describes how the county locally implements Metro's regional growth management requirements, and the amendments include amending the neighborhood's regional design type description in this policy to include middle housing and confirm that middle housing is not subject to density requirements. Next slide, please. CFP Policy 24 is housing discrimination, and this policy confirms that the county encourages and supports equal access to quality housing for all people. The summary of findings and conclusions has very dated information. Some of it is inaccurate and some of it is somewhat offensive. The ordinance proposes to delete this existing information, and updating this policy is an important task that warrants more staff attention than is currently possible. So staff is proposing to update the policy's implementing strategies and summary of findings and conclusions as part of a future work program tasks. Next slide, please. So I want to talk next about some public comments that we received. Commissioner Wellner submitted a comment letter on February 7th, which was distributed to the Planning Commission. And that letter posed questions and comments about ordinances 885 and 886. Staff responses to the ordinance 885 questions will be provided for the March hearing. A staff memo responding to the ordinance 886 questions was distributed to the Planning Commission yesterday. And so the next couple of slides summarize the Commissioner Wellner's questions about ordinance 886 and staff's responses as set out in the staff memo that was distributed yesterday. So one of the first main questions was, or comments was, that detached middle housing should be allowed. And if middle housing is limited to attached and or cottage designs, its construction would be suppressed. On that note, staff notes that this issue is about the Community Development Code changes in Ordinance 885 and not the CFP provisions in the present ordinance. The CFP does not distinguish between detached or attached middle housing. That distinction is made in the Community Development Code and in Ordinance 885. Staff does not believe that further CFP changes are needed to cover the possibility of detached products in the family of middle housing. So staff suggests that this issue be addressed as part of the discussion of Ordinance 885. Next slide, please. Another issue that Commissioner Wellner brought up was questioning how minimum density relates to middle housing. And the CFP does not contain detailed requirements about minimum density. That information is in the Community Development Code. And so this question and this issue is about the Community Development Code changes in Ordinance 885 and not the CFP provisions in the present ordinance. Per state rules, middle housing is not subject to density requirements, either minimum or maximum. However, the Oregon Administrative Rule allows middle housing to be subject to other requirements that apply to single detached dwellings. So the CDC amendments proposed in Ordinance 885 require middle housing that does not meet minimum density to show how the proposal does not preclude future development to minimum density. And the same requirement applies to single detached dwellings on lots of record. This issue, staff recommends that this issue be discussed in further detail as part of the Ordinance 885 presentation. Next slide, please. Commissioner Wellner also asked or commented, since higher density middle housing is not subject to the Policy 19 infill provisions, why not strike them altogether and develop alternative standards? And staff believes that this is a valid point and could make sense for future work. We note that when the infill standards were modified by Ordinance 820 in 2017, that ordinance was somewhat contentious. So staff believes that a proposal to remove them altogether may generate significant community concerns. Staff believes developing replacement standards may be possible as a future task if directed by the Board of Commissioners, but that work is outside the scope of the middle housing ordinance. And lastly, Commissioner Wellner suggested several specific changes to descriptions in a couple of the policies to better reflect current conditions, and staff's response is that if the ordinance is engrossed, these changes could be made. And I want to note here as well that we received 2 additional comment letters today. One of them was from Seth Alford, and the other was from Ryan McKinster of the Home Builders Association. Both of those letters stated that they addressed ordinances 885 and 886, but the issues raised in both letters were specific to the content of ordinance 885, the Community Development Code amendments, and were not applicable to the present ordinance about the CFP changes. Next slide, please. We also received a question from a community member Mary Manso on February 9th. And Ms. Manso had a question about a sentence that was added to policy 18 about the plan designations and locational criteria for development. That policy has an existing description of the R6 district that refers to the public notice requirement that applies to development applications for residential uses that are identified in the Community Development Code as Type 2 uses. And this ordinance added a new sentence to that description, stating that middle housing is also allowed in the R6 district and is not subject to the public notice requirement. And so Ms. Manso asked if all middle housing development in the R6 district would be exempt from the public notice requirement as indicated by that new sentence. So her question highlights an error in that new sentence that needs to be corrected for the consistency with the Community Development Code amendments in Ordinance 885. Ordinance 885 identifies middle housing as a type 1 use for which notice is not required, but it also states that when certain circumstances apply, the Community Development Code will require middle housing to be reviewed through a type 2 process, and that would require public notice. So staff recommends that Ordinance 886 be engrossed to amend the R6 description in Policy 18 to clarify that middle housing is not subject to notice when it's processed through a type 1 review. Next slide, please. So staff recommends that the Planning Commission conduct a public hearing and then recommend approval of Ordinance 886 to the Board of Commissioners with an engrossment to clarify that middle housing is not subject to notice when processed through a type 1 review, and to make the text changes as described in staff's Wellner response memo. And that concludes staff's presentation.
So I'm going to, unless there's a question someone wants to ask briefly right now, but I'm not seeing a hand up. I'm going to open the public hearing. Do we have anyone signed up to give testimony this evening?
We do. Ryan McKinster with the HBA of Metro Portland is here to talk.
Okay. Mr. McKinster, would you please state your name for the record, and you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lockwood. This is Ryan McKinster. I'm the Director of Government Affairs and Policy at the HB Home Builders Association of Greater Portland. I'm actually signed up to speak to Ordinance 885, but if you'd like to take my testimony now, I can do it.
I think it's all right. Why don't you please go ahead?
Okay.
Chair, I would suggest, though, to keep the hearing separate.
Yes, I was right. I agree. As I thought about that, yes. Would you please wait, Mr. McKinster, because we are going to have a public hearing on 885.
Of course. Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone else signed up?
No, there isn't.
Okay, very good. Then I'm going to close the public hearing on Ordinance 886 and welcome questions, comments, discussion from commissioners. Yes, Commissioner Will.
So I have a question for Ms. Savin. You finished your presentation with a recommendation by staff and suggested including in the engrossments the recommended text edits that Commissioner Matt Wellner included in his letter. I see that on attachment B, the staff to the report, I see that he references his comments numbered 27 through 34. Could you maybe clarify which of those ones have text amendments that staff support specifically, or is it all of them?
Well,
thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner Will. We sent out a staff memo yesterday to all planning commissioners that had the questions that Commissioner Wellner posed for Ordinance 886. We renumbered those because we were zeroing in on just the questions for Ordinance 886. So if you have that staff memo in front of you, I think that's a better, probably handier thing to use to refer to. But basically, in that staff response memo, the changes that Commissioner Wellner that was proposing that staff agreed could be made if the ordinance is engrossed include the one under question 1A. So first I'll pause and just ask if you do have a copy of that staff memo.
You know,
before I go on.
I think I only have the public meeting notice mailed to me.
Okay, this was emailed yesterday. The staff memo was emailed to all the planning commissioners.
Yeah, let me just check my inbox, and maybe I just overlooked it. So
yeah,
if you hold maybe a second, so let me.
I mean, I can certainly give sort of a short overview of what the commissioners of what Commissioner Wellner's ask was and what staff was agreeing could be put in the engrossment. If you can't, actually, I'm going to go ahead and do that.
Why don't you do that, Suzanne?
Can someone resend that, perhaps? So it's
yes, Chair. I'm sending that now.
Thank you.
Will.
So I'll just, while that's happening, I'll go ahead and just kind of orally go over this. So, Commissioner Wellner had referenced policy 18 of the CFP on page 1 of that policy, that there's a comparison found in a proposed new paragraph that should refer to single detached homes as traditional single detached homes. You wanted the word traditional added. And that was one change that we said in the staff memo could be made if the ordinance is engrossed. So that's one of the changes. The other changes are, let's see, are to policy 21, which is the housing affordability policy.
I have a question. I'm so sorry, Chair Lockwood. I have one question.
Okay, please go ahead.
Could you tell me the difference between traditional single detached home and just a single detached home? I'm sorry if it's being repeated. Why add the word traditional?
I think what I can say in response is simply what Commissioner Wellner put in his ask, which is what he said was, the comparison found in the proposed new paragraph should refer to single detached homes as traditional single detached homes. As evidenced by the model code, middle housing can take many forms, either attached or detached, and cottage clusters can as well. So what staff said in response to that, Commissioner Padar, in our memo was, we said the Community Development Code includes definitions for the different housing types. This is not a change that staff believes is needed, but it could be made if the ordinance is engrossed.
Thank you.
And so the next change that Commissioner Wellner had requested that we thought could be added at engrossment had to do with policy 21, which is the housing affordability policy. In the summary of findings and conclusions that are on page 10 of the ordinance itself. So Commissioner Wellner had noted that on the paragraph number 7 on that page, there's a proposed new sentence that starts by saying, development process changes and code amendments may impact affordability and development timelines. And Commissioner Wellner recommended that the words may impact be replaced with affect. In other words, the sentence would then read, development process changes and code amendments may affect affordability and development timelines. And staff agreed that's a change we could make if the ordinance is engrossed. And then in policy 22, which is the housing choice and availability policy, on page 12 of the filed ordinance, in the summary of findings and conclusions for that policy, Commissioner Wellner recommended that there be some reference to the recent shift to working from home. And staff agreed that we could put a reference to the increase in working from home due to the development of remote work technology, that we could add that in. And let's see. Lastly, Commissioner Wellner had recommended that a reference be added to the role that accessory dwelling units play in housing affordability. And staff agreed that would be appropriate to add to policy 21, which is the housing affordability policy, under the summary findings and conclusions. And so the staff memo that responded to Commissioner Wellner's questions that we sent out to the Planning Commission by email yesterday actually had some of the exact language that we would add in at engrossment for those things that I just described.
And I would like to note that we have posted that also on the Planning Commission page for members of the public that might want to look at that response.
So there's a total of 4.
Thank you. I received the email to look at it. I'm sorry I didn't see it in the inbox. It may have bounced off or got a mistypo. But thanks for that explanation.
Commissioner Wellner.
Thank you, Chair. Suzanne, thanks for putting together the responsorial letter. It's very helpful. And thanks for taking the time to do it. I do have a couple of clarifications and comments. Give me a second because I got to read through it. So the issue with regard to minimum density, and that I was incorrect, but I think I was incorrect because the comp plan language is unclear, that there is an alternative process to make sure that we ultimately get that density. So I think what you said is it's not a comprehensive plan framework issue. It's not a comprehensive framework plan issue. It's a code issue, and the code elevates it to a type 2 process that then forces you to do a shadow plan. I think is what I heard. Is that correct?
I'm going to say sort of, and I'm probably going to look to Teresa and or Ann Kelly to maybe fill in. But my understanding is that the county cannot require. We can't require at the time that middle housing is proposed. We cannot require it to meet minimum density or a maximum density, but that we can require them to show us that in the future where they're placing the middle housing now will not preclude that that land from being developed to the required minimum density at a future point. Maybe by somebody else, maybe. So
they can't put a fourplex necessarily in the middle of a parcel if that precludes you from getting to minimum density later.
Correct. That's my understanding. So if I misspoke, I'm gonna rely on Anna and Teresa to correct.
That makes sense to me. And I think what I'm reaching for is there's this definitive statement in the comprehensive plan that says you can't apply minimum density. But then there's this other thing in the code that really you can. And I don't think that you should explicitly state that there's this other thing in the code, but maybe there should be some reference to, unless otherwise unless you have to go through a type 2 process, unless it gets elevated to a type 2 process, something that, because it's explicit in one place and then not in another place, which is going to be confusing. And maybe I'm the only person that will ever see it and the only person that will ever be confused by it, but it seems like we should try to at least give it a little bit of consistency, if at all possible, if there's going to be engrossments made.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, because I think that, again, when we're requiring, and I will rely on Ann and Teresa to finesse this because it's more about Ordinance 885, but I believe that, even in the case of middle housing that's being reviewed through a type 2, that when they have to show that the shadow plat, they're not having to provide that additional density. They're having to just show that somebody else is not precluded from providing in the future. So I think that's kind of a difference. So anyway, that's about the extent of my knowledge. So I'm going to just step back and let other people step.
It's the way to make sure you get to minimum density. Yeah, and so you're right. It's not that big of a deal, but the consistency thing is kind of what I was hung up on a little bit. But what you say makes sense. You clarified the multifamily issue with R15NB and that it was just a terminology. I thank you for that. Do you know, has there been any discussion internally about the comment of if it's the will of the board, then we'll work on it? Have you talked at all internally about the infill standards and other items that are going to need to be amended to create consistency and fluidity and so on and so forth, about a follow-up ordinance that might include changes to the infill standards?
I haven't been part of discussions on that so far, but I think there probably have been some, and I actually am guessing that through these hearing processes that, planning commissioners and members of the public will flag for us maybe things that we hadn't even thought of before that we'll need to rectify later. Your point was well taken about, does it make sense to require subdivision for single detached dwellings to have to meet, or a partition to have to meet the infill standards when a potentially a higher density middle housing product doesn't have to? There's an inconsistency there, and that's well taken. And I think we would need to come up. I think that rather than just removing those standards, we'd have to come up with something equal or better. And there's some art and work required to come up with that equal and better thing, and that's why we don't think that's part of the scope of the current middle housing ordinances. But Teresa or others,
I can respond to that. So we are fully aware that as we have been looking at our code to see how we work in the middle housing regulations, that we have found some inconsistencies. We have found some things that we'd like to work on and update in the future. And so we do plan in the next work program to have an item that's a review of some of these things that we've identified and updating other sections to be more consistent. So that is a planned task.
Okay, good. Yeah. Thank you. That's what I was looking for, and thank you. Yep. One clarification on the may impact versus affect terminology. It wasn't the word I had issue with was may, not impact. So I don't want may impact to become may affect, because it's pretty. I want the specificity. It actually has an effect. And it could be a good effect, it could be a bad effect, but it's going to affect. Thank you for the terminology changes under item 5 that you identified. I think those are well written, and that's all I have. Thank you.
Other commissioners? All right, I had a couple of questions. In the this would be policy 18, and it's page 3 of the ordinance exhibit. On the R6 characterization, there's a sentence. It's the R6 district is intended to provide the opportunity for an innovative design at relatively low densities in developing residential areas where no predominant urban character has been established. So I noticed that kind of sentence, that kind of overall philosophical sentence, doesn't seem to appear in the other district descriptions. So I was wondering why that's there and why the difference between R6 and the others as far as characterization.
I'm actually not sure.
No, Suzanne, I can answer that actually.
Okay.
So part of the answer is we moved that sentence up from the bottom of that paragraph to the top of the paragraph. So that was the original description that when this district was developed, that was the original description there. So we weren't rethinking that or changing that. We were leaving it. We were just kind of changing the order of where it was in the paragraph. And the other sections didn't have that. So the idea here was not to do wholesale changes to these policies, but just kind of tweak them to make sure that we were addressing middle housing. And so with that one, we weren't changing the characterization of it. We were just kind of reordering the wording.
Okay.
I'd also want to add just, and maybe I'm reading into your question too much, but there was a distinction when the plans were created in the 80s between the R6 and R5, that R5 was a lot of the existing areas that had already been subdivided in the 40s and 50s and 60s, sort of the Raleigh Hills and parts of Metzger and Aloha and Cedar Hills. And the R6 was intended for the sort of large vacant areas that still were intended for primarily single family housing, but there was a lot more sort of flexibility because you were developing 10, 20, 30 acre lots as opposed to having these existing lots.
Yeah, thank you. So that makes me question, is this out of date, this particular comment? Does it still characterize R6?
I guess Teresa can help me out here. A lot of our plan is out of date. The summary of those particular land use districts don't necessarily reflect contemporary ways of developing land. But I think relative to the other land use districts and recognizing that things are out of date, I'm not sure it's doing harm having the language there.
Yeah. I'm not, it's not important for me to get rid of it, but I just wondered about it. And, I'm thinking about middle housing and how middle housing is an opportunity for innovative design. And in other words, that this could apply to all the districts, maybe, this idea. And anyway, well, thank you for the commentary on that. And then my other question was regarding the policies that say encourage and encourage. And I'm wondering what it means to encourage. Do you know where?
Probably looking at policy 21 that does talk about encouraging the housing industry.
Yeah, right. Page 9. Thank you. And also on that same page, encourage compatible development. Item E. So what does? I wasn't clear on how you encourage.
So I think every place where we talk about encouraging, I think it's recognizing that the county isn't the one that's actually, for the most part, sometimes actually with the housing authority, the county might be the one to be building some housing, but for the most part, the county is not the one doing the building. So what we have are our land use regulations. What we have is possibly fees that can be waived or that sort of thing. So it's more within the realm of what we can do to assist. We can do to encourage someone else to do what we would like them to do, which is build housing that's affordable to certain people.
Okay.
So providing incentives, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments from the commissioners?
Sorry.
Go ahead, Commissioner Petrillo.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't raise my hand. Suzanne, I have a question for regarding the comprehensive framework plan changes. Do they require additional or longer periods of public input or public hearing more so than a change to the development code? Is there a difference in the requirements?
Any of our comprehensive framework plan documents, when they are amended, whether that be the CFP, Community Development Code, or Rural Natural Resource Plan, for example, they're all amended through the ordinance process. So the same process of, sending notice out about the changes and giving people the opportunity to write in or testify.
So they don't have their own separate timeline, longer timelines. Like some jurisdictions, they have comprehensive development. A comprehensive development change has to go through a much longer process than one that's simply a zoning code change. And you're saying that isn't the case with the CFP.
Correct.
Okay. That concludes my question. Thanks.
I'm sensing that there are not further comments or questions. I'm not seeing hands, so I'm wondering if we could get some maybe a brief discussion on what we'd like to do next here regarding Ordinance 886. Yes, Commissioner Will.
I'm asking the same question of my fellow commissioners. I feel very good about the material we received, and I like the fact that the staff recommended some engrossments to address some of the issues raised. And I'm tending to want to move forward, but I do want to hear from my other commissioners if they have other things they want to hear about and delay this particular ordinance till the future, or if they feel comfortable moving forward tonight.
Well, I have a question for staff. If we wanted to engross the ordinance in the way that we've talked about tonight, do we need to wait for another meeting, or can we do that tonight?
So you can move forward tonight with the recommendation on this ordinance to recommend to the board that the board approve the ordinance with the changes that staff discussed and were in those couple documents.
Right, and so the engrossments we're talking about are the 4 that Suzanne described in detail.
Yeah. And there was one from Mary Manso about, the notice, taking out the reference to the notice.
Okay, so that's 5. Okay, Commissioner Wellner. Excuse me, Petrillo.
Yeah, thank you. Suzanne, what is within the proposed changes themselves, page 11, that is the policy, the affordability policy, 21. The last paragraph does a recitation of the North Bethany events that occurred in the conversations that happened, and sort of why is that even relevant at this point? I mean, it's sort of particular for North Bethany. It never really resulted in any workforce housing. It sort of fell on its face. Not due to the county, but I'm just. It seems superfluous. And I guess I'm wondering why is it being recited there?
I think that was originally added back probably in around 2010, I'm guessing, as part of the ordinance that adopted most of the North Bethany provisions in the community plans and the community development code as well, to act as sort of a report out in a sense of what the county had done.
I guess the question is, I can see that, but is it relevant anymore to cite it?
Well, I'm guessing there's other sections in the CFP policies that talk about things that happened. They've already been sort of checked off, so to speak. And so on the one hand, I think staff, agrees with you, Commissioner Petrillo, that sometimes it's sort of we scratch our heads when we look at that a little bit, because we're thinking, is the CFP, is it telling us what we're aiming toward, or is it telling us what we've already done? And it's sort of a mixture of both. And in this case, back when we added this language, which was probably, this paragraph was probably added in about 2010, it was describing what we had done at that point.
Yes, that's what I mean.
And
so I don't want to parse stuff, but I do think it's good once in a while to get feedback on things that just seem out of context, and as you mentioned, if it was included or codified in 2010, probably drafted the year before, and it was adopted, and it was right on top of everything else happening, then it was somewhat relevant. But in 2 more years, it's just it's going to be like, what is that? And then of course it's like, oh, did that result in an affordable housing being built in North Bethany? And it's like, no, it didn't. And so at some point, I think citations like this, aren't relevant as much, and should be. You should think about just. One thing is we try to get a more easier to use code and plan. One way to do that is to edit. So just something to think about. It doesn't necessarily detract from what we're trying to do, but I'm just throwing that out there as feedback.
Thank you.
Commissioner Wellner.
I guess I have a follow-up to that, because there's language added there, then there's language struck there that really doesn't have anything to do with middle housing. So why was that language written? because the language that was written in 2010, the bulk of it struck, and then there's this new handful of language, the Affordable Housing Program Guide for North Bethany Subarea, dated December 10th or December 2010. That's new language with this ordinance, right?
It is. I mean, that paragraph originally was placed there in 2010, and what it described at that time was what staff had done up to that time. And so when we were looking at this again, and we were looking at some of these other policies to see where there were obvious things that were out of date, that paragraph was one of those things, in that it didn't talk about some of the things that had happened between 2010 and now. So,
okay.
so we added those things in, but they're also in the past.
Okay. So while I'm on, I'll echo Commissioner Will's comments. I appreciate you writing the memo on some of the comments that I submitted in my letter. That was very helpful, and I'm supportive of the changes you described, along with addressing a few of the items in my letter, and then also what Mary Manso had brought forth.
Commissioner Petrillo.
Our role here, I hope I'm not muted now. Our role here is to bring perspectives that to share our perspectives that we bring to the table. So going back to the affordability section of the CFP, it's since it sets out principles and sort of and guiding principles and goals and even theories. In page 10, where it talks about summary findings and conclusions, and nowhere in the whole section of affordable housing does it refer to really what is the industry in the federal standard for affordable housing, regulated affordable housing. You refer to it as housing that's limited to eligible households at specified income levels is known as regulated affordable housing. And that's not very insightful for someone reading it who doesn't know what that means. Really what it's saying, that's a very, very general and vague statement. It should say something like, and then go into, in federal, almost all regulated affordable housing is often federally defined, and that's for low-income households. And that's not a pejorative word in the industry or in our vernacular. And 80, which is low-income households, and that the government defines that, the federal government defines that, and the state implements that, and our local housing department implements it the same way. Is 80% of area median income or less is considered low-income regulated housing. And it would be, if we had something, this is giving feedback, something more specific, rather than something so generic it doesn't even, well, who are the eligible households and what are the specific income levels? So it's, that's my comment in terms of being somebody who works in that field. And I should mention, Vice Chair Dye is with us. I don't know but
right, I was just going to mention that too. You just welcome Vice Chair Dye. Just joined us.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I see Commissioner Podar's hands up. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I really appreciate Commissioner Petrillo bringing up the affordability numbers. I'm not ready to vote on this ordinance right now because I need to read some more. But as he's talking about what are the exact numbers, as we know, when we talk about low income again, minimum wage, it's $24,000 a year. So is minimum wage at $15 an hour low income? If it is $24,000 a year, that's $2,000 per month. at the federal level of 30%, rent should be $600. So if we don't, I think we fail. Whenever we talk about affordability, affordable to whom? Majority of the people are priced out of the market. In Washington County alone, in South Hillsborough, in 2 years, people who bought houses at $400,000 is now $800,000. So people who have not been historically, communities of color and people with minimum wage, because of their income level, there has been no pathway to home ownership because people do not have access to mortgages, or you have to make a certain amount of money in order to be eligible to buy a house. Now, think about that if minimum pricing at the average median price of a home now in Washington County is approximately, I think, $350,000, $400,000. So nobody at I can't. I don't know of anybody else that I know that can actually afford to buy a home anymore because they're priced out of the market. So if we talk about affordability to somebody earning $100,000, or the 1,073 some million people that in the country that are earning minimum wage. So those numbers are important. Is rent of $600 even a reality? If it is not, then what is affordability? So when we actually break it down and put numbers in front of us, I think then we will have a lot more equitable housing policies. And I just wanted to say that I'm not ready to vote today. I need to finish reading. It's a lot of reading.
If I can note just a little bit about what our approach to making these changes was. So as Andy noted, there's a lot that's in our comprehensive plan that's out of date, that maybe was written quite a while ago. We didn't have the capacity or the direction from the board to update completely all of these comprehensive plan policies. So what we were trying to do was fix anything that was incorrect, fix things that were very out of date, and add policies and findings that would support the middle housing regulations that we were moving forward with. So we know there are other problems with how this is written, but we weren't able to start from scratch and kind of do it all over.
So I'm speaking out of turn, but I'll just say under that outline, I think you've succeeded, and I think that's a helpful description of what you're trying to do, and I think our comments or my comments just reflect when we open up a Pandora's box. I mean, we just recognize how much more of the code has to be cleaned up or codified or updated. And that task always, as I recall, is like tier 15 and 1050 or something in the work plan. And I'd like to see it moved up, or I would recommend it. But yeah, thank you for that explanation.
Commissioner Potter.
I have another question about, one is the part where we're talking about what affordability is, but also we have a lot of outdated things, a lot of outdated verbiage, but what about things that we really need that says first-time homeowners, that all of the housing development must meet that requirement? Because as I've mentioned this before, I know somebody who owns 10 houses in Orenco Station, and they're renting it out, and that drives up the rental prices. So are we saying that people must be living, those who buy those homes must be living in those homes? Because otherwise we are never going to, we are always going to be chasing this. We are never going to have enough homes. We are at we need about 100,000 new homes right now in Oregon. And so where are those how can we include those words that say that either people must be living in the houses that they are buying, or that they must be first-time home buyers, or are we going to talk about the pricing of these homes, that they must cap at this price, so that we have some more. I'm trying to see that, yes, we are developing things. Yes, we are creating all of these requirements, 25 feet, 35 feet, all of it. But at the end of it, somebody who's just going to buy a house, they are not seeing all of those little nuances. They're not seeing, oh, I have 25 feet here or 30 feet here. They're seeing, can I buy something? Can I live in a place? Can I build some equity? Can I afford to live here? Are the neighborhoods, are they connected? Like, are there cultural spaces? Are there parks where we can actually be and hang out? And so I think there is a lot of, if redundant things need to go away, then how do we get rid of them and put in things that are actually practical and applicable to current circumstances? Can we do that?
And my only suggestion is that is something that we could put in our work program for a future look at those housing policies that we have in here, for broader than just the middle housing. I think what you're raising is much broader than just kind of the ordinance that we have before us. And the middle housing, it's the much bigger issues that are important, but may not be able to be addressed through these two ordinances.
Commissioner Petrillo.
I just wanted to respond to Commissioner Podar. I think she raises the ideals of what would be useful. What would be in the interest of the public, perhaps. But on the other hand, I think I also want to respond to Commissioner Podar to say we live within a free market enterprise system and in a regulated legal constitutional system where the property rights actually have a higher priority than necessarily some of the justice and equitable goals that you're referring to. And the type of policies that you would refer to, like, limiting people who own a certain number of homes and rent them out, or requiring owner occupancy, maybe of or limiting the number of rental or something. The court system wouldn't, people would sue over it. The state law doesn't allow it, that kind of regulation. And so I do think it's helpful to talk about it in general goals of equity, equitable and justice, but there's limits to it based on the system that we operate under, which is more oriented to a free market system than, for instance, many European systems where the government does regulate housing to a far greater degree. And or even in Canada, Vancouver is city of Vancouver is more regulated about rentals and occupancy.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Petrillo, we are in a free market economy, but I think state-wise and federal government, right now, there is a goal to ensure that there is shelter. So, and that we are in the midst of ensuring racial justice, and historically, so there are all of these goals that now don't they, please somebody correct me, that supersede a free market circumstance when it comes to building? Because it feels to me like we're talking about middle housing, we are talking about building all of this, but then we're not addressing the issue that is affordability and who's getting access to it. So we can keep talking middle housing, it's still going to be for the privileged, it's still going to be for the rich people, it's still going to be for the traditional mindset.
I think it's the fundamental contradiction that we live as Americans, that we have this set of creeds about equality and equal opportunity, and then we have the reality, and we often don't our system doesn't live up to its creed sometimes.
Good, then we have a chance right now to to say that this is our goal, but we are not going all the way. So how about we start changing those systems, because we have to meet the federal requirement that says everybody must be sheltered. Our state requires that people be sheltered. We are in the midst of a shelter crisis. People don't have places to live. So if everybody is going, plus we are trying to meet transportation standards. So if people are going to, with not high income, I won't say low income, not very high income, if they're going to be pushed to the fringes and they do not have access to transportation or transit, we are in the midst of a climate crisis. We're not addressing the real issue. I think we're just building all of these buildings, middle housing and all of it for the privilege, for Wall Street, for all of it. So I'm not comfortable voting or even talking. It's just not sitting well that we are not addressing who's going to have access to these homes at any level. We are not ensuring that.
You just did, and I think that's useful. I just think there's a limitation of our system doesn't allow for that full. But I think we're getting off topic.
Yeah, let's recognize Commissioner Will, please. Mr. Bobette. Oh, right, he's on. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you, Chair Lockwood, and I do want to express appreciation for my fellow commissioners' concerns, and I wanted to comment that we are talking about the framework plan, which is an overarching sort of document, and there was some concern that maybe in the summary and findings there wasn't enough specifics. I think the first sentence talks about a general number, 30% of households' gross income, and the 50% net income numbers there. So I think the framework plan does get to the idea that there is an issue out there, and the details that my commissioners are concerned about are probably for other documents or future work, as Teresa Cherniak mentioned, is possible to get to some of the roots of those concerns. But it's kind of like, if you're a teacher and you're correcting a math test, you don't want to complain too much about the quality of the ink pen. You want to know whether the answer to the math question is correct. And I think I'd like to get back to the question at hand of whether we want to move forward with this. I appreciate Commissioner Podar mentioned that there's a lot to read, and I know that this ordinance is a little bit shorter and less complicated than the other ordinance. And so some of the commissioners haven't mentioned whether they want to move forward. But I would like to, and I don't know how to move forward without, disrespecting the people who haven't read everything yet. But maybe if there's a majority of the people that have and want to move forward on this, and we could, and then if we don't want to move forward on it, I guess my point is I'm not sure what the staff is going to provide new to us between this meeting and the next. So I'd be happy to vote now or first thing in the next meeting. Do I need to make a motion to vote?
Let me. I see that Mr. Borkowitz has his hand up, so let's see what his comment is.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Chair. I just wanted to highlight that Commissioner Blake, Vice Chair Blake, has left the meeting.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think we have a question from Commissioner Will, whether we're ready to move forward, whether we want to make a motion at this point. I don't think I can be as eloquent as Commissioner Petrella, but I do appreciate the issues that Commissioner Podar brings up. They're very important issues. I wonder if they are issues that they're certainly appropriate for us to talk about, but they're bigger than our commission. There's a broader political aspect, I think, to what she's saying. And we are, as Commissioner Will pointed out, we do have statements in this ordinance that we're discussing right now, 886, that address the issues of affordability and recognize those issues. So I think we could move forward tonight if that's the will of the commission. Commissioner Havener.
I guess to meet the commission's calling and the desire of Commissioner Will, I could recommend approval of ordinance number 886 to the Board of Commissioners.
Do you want?
Well, there's an elephant in the room here. I just want to share.
Go ahead.
We don't have to have a consensus about whether to make a motion. Commissioner Will or Commissioner Havener or even Commissioner Podar can just set it forth, and the opinion of the commission will be essentially whether there's a second and whether there's an affirmative vote for that motion. So, Commissioner Will, if you feel that this is an appropriate time to move this forward, you should feel free to make the motion and see if you have a colleague that's willing to second it to carry it forward.
So yes, thank you. Mr. Bovet.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just noticed that the motion only applied to the ordinance as crafted, and so it probably would need a friendly amendment to reflect the engrossment recommendations.
Yes. Commissioner Will.
I wanted to clarify what I was afraid to make a motion and then like say majority of the commissioners aren't prepared to vote and they vote no. So I didn't know if I was hoping that the majority of them would say they want to move forward and make a vote. If they don't, then I would respect them and not make a motion, although one appears to have been made.
Well, you can offend me, that's fine.
The process would be a motion, a second, and then discussion. So there could be, development of sentiment and opinion during that discussion time. Commissioner Wellner.
Would you be willing to accept a friendly amendment to include the engrossments described by staff, by Suzanne earlier, along with the change proposed by Mary Mansell?
With Mr. Bovet's blessing, yes, I would.
Well, that's a question of Commissioner Havener. Would he be willing to accept that?
I'd be willing to accept that amendment to the motion.
Okay, with that, I would second the motion.
Okay, we have a motion. Did someone else want to make a comment?
I just said, can we restate it? I think you were.
Yes, we have a motion to approve ordinance 886 with the engrossments described in this meeting, and I'm not sure if that's the right language. Should it be more specific than that, or Mr. Bovet?
I kind of like the way the motion was phrased itself, which referenced the four specific engrossments mentioned by Suzanne, as well as the additional one we received by letter.
Okay, to recommend to the board approval of 886 with the engrossments, which include the four items described by staff in the letter to Commissioner Wellner and the correction we received by letter
from Mary Mansell.
From Mary Mansell. So that's been moved and seconded. Discussion. Mr. Commissioner Will, I think you have your hand up.
I'm curious about making a further amendment, motion for another amendment. If I made that a motion for a further amendment, would we vote on my amendment separately if it was seconded?
Well, we have to deal with this one first. before going to another one. Did you want?
Unless you're asking for another friendly amendment, and then you'd have to go through the ritual of asking the maker of the motion to accept another friendly amendment, and then asking the second to accept it as well, if that's what you had in mind, Commissioner Will, or was this just a separate motion entirely?
I don't want to jeopardize the existing motion that's been seconded with a further amendment. So that's why I was wondering if my further amendment could be decided independently.
It's hard for me to answer in the abstract because I have no idea what you have in mind.
If it's related to this motion, if there's a nexus to this motion, then you would ask, and then you would make a motion to amend the motion on the floor. And if you get a second, we vote on it, and the motion would be amended. If it failed, we go back to the original motion.
That's what I'd like to do. I'd like to make a motion to amend the motion on the floor to add a further engrossment to include striking of the final paragraph of policy 21 of ordinance number 886 on page 11, I believe it is, beginning with the text from the North Bethany sub area, comma, continuing to the end of that.
I second that motion, that amendment, the motion for amendment.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. This is Mr. Bobette. I'll need your help walking through this.
It's an amendment to the motion that's on the floor, so you'll need to take discussion on this motion to amend the motion and see if the rest of the commission wants to do that. So we need to deal with Commissioner Will's motion first by way of discussion.
Yeah, is there discussion of what he just proposed, essentially? The amendments, motions on the floor.
And that's to strike that paragraph.
Yes.
Yes. Commissioner Wellner. You're on mute. You're
just
muted.
Want to clarify where that motion, Commissioner Will, would strike the discussion of the Affordable Housing Program Guide for North Bethany?
No, it would the last paragraph that, yes, I'm sorry, the whole paragraph with North Bethany, correct? Commissioner Will? Yes.
On page 11, yeah.
Yes, to clarify that full paragraph from the words beginning with for the North Bethany sub-area, comma, committee, all the way to the end of the strike through at the last paragraph of policy 21. And the intent is to meet commissioners' previous statements about, why are we including this and can't we clean it up? If we all can do some common sense cleaning up right here cleanly, I think it's a good idea. And to recommend that engrossment.
I didn't pay him to make that motion, I promise.
Commissioner Wellner, go ahead.
Yeah, I have clarification of staff. There's still an Affordable Housing Program Guide for North Bethany, right?
Yes.
Is there any other reference in the comprehensive plan to it other than this one location?
I'm not aware that there is.
Suzanne, is there anything in the
community plan? I think there might be.
Yes.
Yeah, there probably is. I actually don't know for certain, but I think there probably is.
Okay.
I
guess I don't have an opinion otherwise on this one.
So is there further discussion, I guess?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. Both Mr. Wellner and Mr. Will have their hands up. Okay, hands are down. Any further discussion on this motion to strike this paragraph? And can we do this, Mr. Bobette, just by saying all in favor? Or do we need a roll call?
You need a roll call.
Okay. May we have a roll call vote, please? This is on striking that paragraph.
A point of order. Since I made the initial motion, don't I have to accept the amendment?
He didn't offer it as a friendly amendment. He offered it as actually a motion to amend or motion. So
No
there was a couple of pathways and he chose a different pathway.
No worries.
Okay, so I'll call the votes then. Commissioner Havner,
I support the amendment.
Commissioner Milliman,
Yes.
Commissioner Petrillo,
Yes.
Commissioner Podar,
Yes.
Commissioner Wellner,
Yes.
Commissioner Will, Commissioner Will, did you say?
I unmuted and I said yes. Perhaps I muted too quickly.
Oh, okay, thank you. Vice Chair Dye is still not logged back on. Chair Lockwood?
Yes.
So that looks like there's 7 yeses. Motion passes.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
So now
we're back to the main motion, which now has 6 components, the 4 discussed by Suzanne, as well as the letter, and now the new amendment striking the paragraph. So now there's 6 components to the motion.
Okay. It's been moved and seconded to recommend to the board approval of ordinance 886 as engrossed. And I think we need a roll call on that, correct?
Actually, I think you need discussion first because
Thank you. I knew I was getting off.
The motion to amend with the discussion. So now we're back to discussion on the main motion.
As amended.
Thank you. Is there discussion of this motion? Commissioner Will.
I support Commissioner Havner's motion, and it was seconded. And I recommend we all vote yes and as amended, and move on to the next ordinance.
Commissioner Podar.
I need more numbers because this is just. I know we mentioned that 30% of household gross income, 50% of net income, all of that, but it is still relative. So I will be voting no because it's just who's reading it. It depends upon that. When we put in actual numbers, then things start making more sense. So I think those tables need to be included, but that's just, it's my recommendation. But at this moment, I can't vote yes for this. A little bit more of understanding is required. So,
any further discussion? I'm not seeing any other hands up, so I think we're ready to call the roll.
Okay, Commissioner Havner.
Yes.
Commissioner Milliman.
Yes.
Commissioner Petrillo.
Yes.
Commissioner Podar.
No.
Commissioner Wellner.
Yes.
Commissioner Will.
Yes.
Vice Chair Dye is still not logged back on. Chair Lockwood.
Yes.
And it looks like there's a total of 6 yeses and 1 no. Motion passes.
All right, so 886 is recommended to the board with engrossments. Before we move on, and since we've been talking now for an hour and a half, why don't we take a 5-minute break? Is there any objection? Seeing none, I'll see you in 5 minutes.
Susan, this is Sushmita. You are unmuted and the camera's on.
Thank you.
No problem.
Welcome back. Those who are here. So I think that the next item on the agenda is Ordinance 885. So Mr. Borkowitz.
Chair, just a reminder to, you might want to do a roll call.
Oh, thank you.
Make sure everybody's here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
May we have a roll call, please?
Yes. Commissioner Havner.
Present.
Commissioner Milliman.
Present.
Commissioner Petrillo.
Present.
Commissioner Podar.
Present.
Commissioner Wellner.
Present.
Commissioner Will.
Present.
And Chair Lockwood.
Present. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
All right. Next item is Ordinance 885. May we have the staff presentation, please?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Lockwood, and good evening, Commissioners. I'm Ann Kelly, a Senior Planner in Community Planning, and tonight I'll present a presentation for our first public hearing on the key CDC amendments that are proposed and some analysis related to those. Next slide, please. So this is just a kind of an overview of what we'll talk about tonight. There are a number of things on the agenda. We'll look first just at the bill, and then we'll talk about its effects, why we're not proposing to use model code even on an interim basis. And then we'll talk more about what we might go into further in future hearings, and then the key amendments. So tonight we do hope to get through a number of things, and then we are proposing to do some deeper conversations on several topics. Next slide, please. So what is middle housing? This may be the first time that some of the public is seeing our information, so it may be redundant for some of you commissioners, and I'm sorry about that. But anyway, the state defines middle housing for purposes of HB 2001 as a duplex, triplex, quadplex, cottage cluster, or townhouse development. State law does require us to allow these housing types within neighborhoods. This diagram is intended to show the graduation in scale of different middle housing types and how they might compare to a single detached dwelling, not necessarily that they would be physically separated from single detached homes. Next slide, please. And what is HB 2001? Well, this House bill is one tool to hopefully give Oregonians more housing choices in residential neighborhoods. It was adopted in 2019 and rules for its local implementation in 2020. The bill requires us and other metro counties and large cities and medium-sized cities throughout the state to adopt middle housing provisions. It requires us to allow middle housing in all our residential districts where we allow a single detached home. It does not require property owners to build these or developers, but it does require us to allow them. Existing local density controls that apply right now won't apply to middle housing. The rules do specify some density provisions that we can apply, specific ones, as well as some unit caps for certain development types. Overall, local standards must not discourage middle housing through unreasonable cost or delay. The rules only allow standards that are outlined in the rules or the model code that we apply to a single detached home, or something less restrictive than any of those. So we do have to adopt some standards by June 2022, or the model code will apply, at least in the interim, until we would adopt something. Next slide, please.
I raised my hand. One moment. Could we go back to that slide, please, Anne?
Sure. I'm sorry, I can't really see you, so.
No problem. You mentioned that the county will allow but not require. So could you please confirm that we can allow more middle housing when a development is happening, but we will not require it where there are single detached homes?
We must allow in the districts where we do allow a single detached dwelling all of those middle housing types, but we don't. The bill doesn't require that those things be built. We actually have to allow for more of them than we do right now.
So this is just encouraging, but it will not require. So if people, developers, still property owners and developers still want to continue to only build single detached homes, they can still continue to do that.
They would have that option, yes.
Okay. All right. All right, thanks.
Thank you. So just a quick history. In older neighborhoods, single detached homes and middle housing are often seen side by side. They serve people with a mix of incomes, life stages, wants, and needs. Subdivisions, though, that were built after the 1940s, after World War II, were often just developments of single detached homes, though. And those often came with, simply a higher cost of the single detached home as compared to other types that excluded many people. And sometimes HOA, deed, or rental restrictions that explicitly excluded people. So many people have, over time, lost ability to live in neighborhoods that are single family only or single detached housing only. Middle housing can provide choices, though, for people who are low or middle income. Small households, young adult or senior households, extended households, multi-generational, and even people who've been discriminated against in the past. They can help to rebuild economic and population diversity. They can boost the stability and success factors for households. They can reduce commutes to schools, services, jobs, recreation, family, and friends. And they can also bring property owners new income streams, allowing them to, add a unit or more to then bring in income that helps them pay their mortgage. So a good housing mix expands options in all price ranges, helping to reduce high bidding on historically affordable homes so that lower wage earners can compete.
Excuse me, I think Commissioner Potter has her hand up.
Okay, thank you. I won't be able to see.
No problem. And after reading this, everything that you just said, so we will not the county will not require it. The county will not encourage it. The county will not give benefits for building it, but will just allow it. So in all honesty, it just feels like we're just saying that, yes, this is good for the community. We need it. We need all of that. But there is nothing that goes all the way to say that we must have it. So, yeah, I just wanted to highlight that literally from these 3 slides, that's what I get, that the county is not requiring, not encouraging, not giving benefits, just saying, yes, we will allow more of middle housing. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
I would say that the first step to encouraging more is allowing more. And we do already allow these types in our residential neighborhoods, almost all of the types in all of the neighborhoods. This will mean that we're allowing more, that more lots will be eligible. This brings new options to not just production builders, but people who may be aging and want to divide their house up and have a second unit or a third as a duplex or triplex. It gives more options for someone's mother to live next door as she ages, for example. So it's opening doors. I agree with you. It's not going as far as requiring people to do this sort of thing. And this is the first step. I don't know that we won't be providing incentives in the future.
So all new development, the ones that are going to add to their existing structures, is one thing, but no new development, if we don't require it, again, we do not meet the need for more housing. because people, and again we're only making it only accessible to wealthy people. It just feels like we are doing things, but we don't do it to begin with. Let's do it the right way. It feels like we're taking 2 steps, but not taking the 8 more that we need. So it just feels very, very heartbreaking.
So I'm sorry, it does feel that way. We really don't have the right now to require that this be built. So we will have to rely somewhat on the market and what homeowners and property owners choose to do as we see this move forward. Shall we move on?
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you. Okay. So what's the main effect on Washington County's allowances and regulations? There are a lot of jurisdictions in Oregon that do have zones that are exclusively single detached homes. We don't have that. All of our residential districts already do allow single detached, as well as duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and townhouses. And 3 of our residential districts do already allow cottage clusters. So just the requirement to allow middle housing doesn't have a huge effect on the county right now. What does affect us the most is that we do need to require more, and we were just talking about this. But when you think about it, right now we have a lot of single detached homes on lots that are not big enough under current minimum density to allow for 2 units. Those will all be allowed to now have a duplex. There are also other properties where we will be applying minimum lot sizes that might only be eligible for, a limited number of units under current density standards, whereas they could do quite a few more potentially under middle housing regulations. So that will be the biggest change for us, is that we are removing barriers to more of this type of housing. Next slide, please. And why not just model code? Model code is a set of standards put together by the state that local jurisdictions can adopt. And it's somewhat aspirational. It's very design heavy, and it exceeds what's in the rules for HB 2001. The board has directed us to draft county-specific standards that meet the minimum requirements of the bill. And they'd like us to do that for adoption before the state's June 30th deadline. We do expect that there will be more revisions over time to the county standards as part of future work programs, besides certain engrossments that we will likely propose, and we may receive requests for moving through hearings. But delaying adoption of locally drafted standards and defaulting to the model code in the interim is not something that we recommend. It could cause confusion for staff and other code users, builders, and the public, and potentially cause delays. These permits will be very time sensitive. All of the information will be new to our staff and a number of partners. Many of these applications will be type 1, which is a 30-day review, compared to very similar projects right now that give us 120 days to review. So it's going to be a lot of learning very quickly. So model code does not integrate any local practices that guide our staff and our partner agencies in review. So that would be quite a loss in terms of quickly applying standards of the model code. Model code is also visionary. It's not minimum standards.
And Chair Lockwood,
yes.
and could you please talk about one local practice that the model code does not integrate? Just an example so we understand better.
Well, for example, the model code is more strict in terms of where accesses can be provided. We have not applied many design standards that are quite detailed from the model code. We are allowing more flexibility in cottage design. We are not applying floor area ratio requirements. We're allowing space below ground in a cottage not to be counted toward the maximum. There are any number of things, and I would like to say that this is one of the focus areas that we propose to talk about in a future hearing. So if it's possible, if we could keep it a little bit briefer today, you'll see at the end of this that we are proposing to go a bit deeper in this conversation.
Great. Thank you. I just needed to know what example that meant. What does local practice mean? Thank you.
Model code also would not be adopting, it does not include minimum lot sizes, and we are proposing minimum lot sizes. So, for example, if it were adopted on an interim basis, there would be many more lots that would be eligible under model code. So that's not something that's less restrictive. That's actually, that is something that's less restrictive in model code. So if we were to later adopt our own standards and we did want to apply minimum lot sizes, we would then be effectively removing property rights that had been in place from model code. And that can create problems with property value and rights losses and related concerns. So those are all things we'd need to think through. Many of the things we're proposing, especially design related, are less restrictive, but that's one thing where we are being more restrictive as proposed. Next slide, please. So our approach and intent, it does consider very much the context of our existing CDC and review practices. Most of the changes for middle housing are proposed in CDC sections where staff and our other community users look for residential review criteria now, and with similar formatting so that when they have to hit, when the rubber hits the road, they can open the code and find what they're looking for where they look for it now. So amendments also do affect many of our CDC sections, as you've seen if you looked at the exhibit. But they also affect responsibilities of a number of divisions within the county and a number of external partners who take part in the review process as well. So for all of them, making things as familiar as possible is one of our goals. And our intent, again, is to help our staff and those partner agencies best adjust to the new criteria at the required pace. Next slide, please. I believe we just talked about some of this with Commissioner Kodar's question. But we do have a number of meetings scheduled. We have the 2nd and the 16th for certain, and the 30th as an additional possibility. We are recommending taking testimony, following up on topics of interest, and deliberating on those, and talking further about preferred direction at those. And we do have some recommendations in terms of focus topics, and those are listed here. More detail on the potential for detached plexes, some apparent conflicts between the state's middle housing law and transportation planning rule, some more detail on differences between model code and what we've proposed, and then a deeper dive into community feedback, public testimony and comments, and so forth. So should we stop for just a moment to talk about this before we move on to key amendments?
To talk about future meeting topics, is that right?
Yeah, what might be best for you?
Yeah, commissioners, any comments on that?
If I might just add, we put this here to kind of be a prelude to maybe be thinking about this as we're going through all of the rest of the presentation, that there'll be things that maybe we can talk about quickly and other things where you'll really want to dive more deeply. So maybe these are the things we're thinking so far are probably those deeper dives. And maybe as we go through the rest of the presentation, if there are other things, maybe you can be noting those and we can add to this list. So we just wanted to make you aware of the things we were already knowing. We're probably not going to get to the level that you'll be most interested in through this first overview, but know that we're planning to come back with more on them.
Oh, that's a good idea. Okay, and we can always zip back to this slide at the end to refresh our memories and move on. Okay, then next slide, please. So moving into some discussion of key amendments. We, in our definitions section, which is Article 1, of course, we've added terms and definitions as the basis for the middle housing standards. We've also made changes to existing terms that are used to describe certain housing types, those that include the word family. We do want to recognize the diversity of households that can live in these different housing types and that do. So our definitions borrow from state rules, model code, and add county context. State rules do allow us, but don't require us to define plexes as detached units. So we're not proposing to do that right now. We are proposing them only as attached. And we will talk about that, or we hope to talk about that in more detail in the future. In Article 2, neighborhood meeting requirements are addressed, and they do currently exempt middle housing and middle housing land divisions. The state limits the standards that we can apply. And we must not, again, I'll just say it one more time because it's the overarching concern throughout, we must not individually or cumulatively discourage the development of middle housing through unreasonable cost or delay. So we have to be careful about adding layers. The current CDC does not require a neighborhood meeting for one house. And to apply it for middle housing, we would need to do that. We would need to require it for one house. So shall we move on? And then moving into land use districts, we make changes here to address some changes to land use review types for single detached and for middle housing. These are all the districts here shown. These are all of our residential districts where we allow right now a single detached dwelling. So these are all of the affected districts in terms of middle housing. And as we noted before, there is already an allowance for most types in all of these districts. And I believe we've gone over some of this. We do have to allow a duplex on any lot. Existing density controls don't apply. There are caps that we can apply on triplexes in terms of unit numbers, and we are proposing to do that. And there are some density controls. Townhouses are allowed at a much higher density than what we currently allow. They have to be allowed at 4 times the current density or 25 units per acre, whichever is less. And there's a minimum density that the state requires for cottage clusters, and that's 4 units per acre, so not very high. But otherwise, there is no density provision that applies to middle housing. Let's see. And then for review types for a single detached home or some home expansions, very large ones, over 2,000 square feet. And for middle housing, a type 1 is possible if there is sidewalk present and there is existing right-of-way. We do provide specific right-of-way widths that we're looking for each type of road classification within the CDC to be very clear and objective for this. And where current density will be met, that is another criteria to make something a type 1. So a type 2 for any of these housing types would be sidewalk and right-of-way are not proposed and not present, and the application won't meet minimum density. And again, we're not requiring minimum density, but we are requiring that where a development will not meet it, it's not precluding it either. So we can probably move on to the next slide.
Can I interrupt briefly to just say Vice Chair Dye has joined us?
No. Thank you. Okay, so still on the land use districts, the rules don't require but do allow jurisdictions to adopt minimum lot sizes. This is something different from model code.
And I have a question, Chair Lockwood. Sorry, I raised my hand, but I know that it's not visible.
Okay.
You mentioned about the sidewalk that we still won't require it.
We will require the sidewalk if it's not present, but in many cases it may be. These are often going to be single detached homes that have already gone through a subdivision review, and with a subdivision review, sidewalks are required. Many of them will already have sidewalks.
Okay, but sidewalks will be required. I just want to clarify that.
Yes, where they're not present, we will require them, although there are there's an exemption process that someone can apply for as well.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so anyway, the state does allow us to apply minimum lot sizes, and it specifies as the largest that we can require. And those are what we're choosing at this point to apply. And those are reflected here in the left column. The rules require that setbacks and height limits be no more stringent than for a single detached house in the same district. And then additionally, they limit any of those to no more than 10 feet for a cottage cluster. So even where they might be larger for a different housing type, we can't apply anything larger there.
Excuse me, I see Commissioner Wellner's hand is up.
Thank you.
Just a couple clarifications. So that reduced side yard in R5 and R6 is just going to be tied to building code, right? Just the 3-foot side yard with the easements?
Yeah, so that's in the development code now for R9 and up, just not R5, R6.
Okay. And then the sidewalk conversation, the right-of-way and the sidewalk conversation, I'm assuming it'll be on your list of things we're going to talk about in more detail, but if it's not, I think it should be.
Okay, yeah. Well, we are looking to talk more about public improvements, and certainly, yes, that will be a part of it.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So, excuse me, because I have high blood sugar. So I think we can probably move on unless there were any more questions about this slide. Okay, so now we're into Article 4 and neighborhood circulation. This is an existing CDC section that currently requires for type 2 or 3 development or land divisions where there's an oversized block, a long block length, a large block perimeter. This requires an applicant to provide a through street, or at minimum, there's a modification that can occur just to provide a pedestrian and a bike access way through. But the rules for middle housing As far as street requirements do appear to be limited to emergency standards, not as extensive as county road standards. Where middle housing is all on one lot, though, these are often likely to be type 1s, which are not subject to this section right now. And for type 2, we do have this limitation to emergency standards. So it's possible that fire district standards might require a through street in certain cases, but it's hard to know. It likely would be a case-by-case basis, and this is something we can talk about more in a future hearing. And SB 458, which relates to middle housing land divisions, which we'll be addressing in more detail in a separate ordinance, that Senate bill does allow more improvements along frontages of resulting lots. So where lots do end up with street frontage, we could require something more like a half street, but beyond those off-site situations, it's unclear at this moment. Senate Bill 458 also does prohibit us from requiring driveways and vehicle access. So a lot of this has some inconsistencies with the transportation planning rule, and we will be looking into that a bit more. So let's move along, please. Section 409 is private streets, and it includes private sidewalks as well. We will be adding requirements for sidewalks, just like we will be for private sidewalks, private street sidewalks, just like we will when something's on a public street in this section 409. We will be requiring fire district confirmation that there's sufficient emergency access, and that's consistent with the state's requirement that middle housing, at least beyond a duplex, have sufficient infrastructure, which is quite a limited definition. So 409 does require some things that are consistent with what we'll talk about in a second about public improvements. Grading and drainage is section 410. And this section requires that all development comply. It holds development subject to county and state plumbing codes and clean water services design and construction standards. And middle housing will be no different. So the state rules do require that middle housing have sufficient infrastructure. And that does include storm, sanitary, water, and emergency access. So we do have the right to require sufficient storm and sewer. And this is also in line with statewide planning goal 6, which requires that waste discharge be managed from all development. And there's a quote, or there's a cite from the state language there. We can move along to the next slide. For parking, we can only require one off-street space per middle housing unit. Applicants can provide more if they would like to, but we can only ask for one per unit. And there is no provision for on-street parking in terms of middle housing. So we are proposing to require the one space per unit off-street. We're not currently proposing an allowance that is in model code, whereby we could allow swapping of an on-street space for off-street space. But we're not proposing that. So I guess that's a little bit less generous than model code. In floodplains and significant natural resource areas, because the state allows, or because the state requires that we allow a middle housing duplex wherever we currently allow a single detached, we will be allowing a duplex, but we won't be, we're not proposing to allow other types of middle housing in these areas to protect the resources. There was a question, I think, last when we met about accessory dwelling units and how they play in with middle housing. They're not defined under the middle housing rules as middle housing. And model code does require that if an accessory dwelling unit in a single detached home, if together those things can meet the definition of a single detached home with an ADU or a duplex, then the applicant has to tell us which one they want us to consider it, and it remains that way thereafter. So it's kind of important because different criteria apply to a middle housing duplex versus an accessory dwelling unit, and one is middle housing and one is not under state rule. So that is why we're doing that. And then let's move on. Okay, so section 430-37 is an existing code section where we apply certain design standards to a single detached dwelling, and where we also have some type 2 standards right now that apply when a single home is going on a large lot and more density could be achieved. It's not even meeting minimum density. So we already have this review in place for a single detached dwelling, and that's very convenient for us to use for middle housing as well if it's not proposed to meet what we currently expect for other housing in terms of minimum density. So for example, if someone has a large lot and all they want to do is split their home into 2 units, but they could, effectively achieve 8 if they did normal development, we want to make sure that we're protecting that development potential. So infill development is also in Article 4, Section 430-72, and it's a little misleading, the name, because we talk about infill frequently, but this only applies to R5 and R6 land divisions. It doesn't apply to individual dwellings, and there's not a good way to apply it to middle housing. It's not something that's included in the rules or the model code, and we don't apply it to one house. So we're making middle housing exempt from this requirement. It also includes some standards that are not extremely clear and objective. So state law requires clear and objective provisions for both middle housing and all needed housing. We do, of course, have other design standards that will apply to middle housing, and we have standards for single detached homes already that we're amending slightly, just updating. Next slide, please. 430-84 is our new special use section, and it includes the more detailed design standards for middle housing that we are proposing. It includes general standards for all of the middle housing types. Duplexes, we're just making subject to the same standards be applied to a single detached home, so it doesn't go into them again here in the middle housing section. So I won't go over it again and again, but we are restricted in what we can apply. So we can't go too far beyond the rules, the model code, or what's required for one house. The standards from model code that we've borrowed from generally cover entries, building orientation, window coverage, access, garage placement, and parking. There are some additional standards for townhouses and cottage clusters in terms of articulation on the building exterior for townhouses and the layouts of cottage clusters. We do propose, again, a discussion in a bit more detail about model code in the future. Next slide, please. Our Our middle housing standards also deal with ADUs a tiny bit more. There's a little bit of a conundrum with an ADU, which does lead us to apply that model code standard. We do want someone to say whether they want an existing ADU to remain an ADU, the way we consider it, or to be part of a duplex or even a triplex or quadplex, one of the units. Regardless, the unit will count toward the maximum of units on the property in a plex or toward the maximum density. Somebody could retain an ADU as an ADU, but once the primary dwelling is converted to middle housing, that ADU would become non-conforming because our code right now only allows an ADU with a detached primary dwelling. So it would still be allowed, but it would be allowed because it conforms to the standards that were in place when it was built. It would no longer conform. And that would be okay, but then if somebody later proposed a middle housing land division, there's only one unit per lot in a middle housing land division, so it would be difficult to have an ADU. It becomes an issue in terms of, dividing up units, and ADUs are not middle housing, so creating a lot just for an ADU is another issue. Townhouses are the only type of middle housing that require division, so retaining an ADU with a townhouse also becomes difficult. Let's move on to the next slide.
Oh, excuse me.
Sure.
Commissioner Will's hand is up. Please go ahead.
Hello, thank you, Chair. And I would just like to point out that this topic of ADUs is something that I'm interested in speaking about or discussing with staff and commissioners in the community more deeply. If that wasn't already on the agenda, please.
Okay, sure. I think we mentioned it last time, but we do already allow 2 ADUs per primary dwelling unit, one internal and one external, which is more than many jurisdictions currently. They aren't considered middle housing under the state rule, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't do more with ADUs, and we have often thought about it. It just might not be particular to the middle housing ordinance, but we can certainly talk more about that. So public facilities and services is where the code deals with public streets and improvements related to those, and sidewalks. Public sidewalks is under the same article in section 502. We do propose some engrossments to just clarify a bit more about what applies when, but the intent is to require sidewalk where it doesn't exist for a single detached home or a duplex, as well as right-of-way. I'm sorry, I must have said that. It does retain the requirement to pay TDT, or that's transportation development tax, and system development charges, and it retains the same requirements in terms of access and site distance. For expansion or replacement of a single detached home, it would be the same as above, but not the transportation development tax, because that presumably would already have been gathered with development originally. For middle housing, it would be the same as for a single detached home. But except for duplexes, we would also be looking for service provider confirmation of sufficient infrastructure in terms of how the state defines that. And then if a middle housing proposal is going to be a middle housing land division, it would be all of that. And in addition, it could potentially be things like half streets along the frontages of lots resulting from the division. So rules do allow us to do all of this. In part, some of this is reliant on requiring sidewalk and right-of-way for a single detached home in order to be able to apply it to middle housing. However, the community has come to us over and over for a long time, many years, with concerns about sidewalk gaps. And the reason for requiring these improvements of a single home is not just to be able to require it for middle housing. It's so that all of these home types could potentially contribute toward helping to fill in sidewalk gaps in existing communities. Next slide, please. So now getting back to just a little bit more detail on detached plexus, and again, we will do more later if anyone is interested at a future hearing. But we do currently propose that duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes all be defined only as attached. That is how we define them in the current CDC. Our draft regulations allow similar alternatives through the cottage cluster standards that we're proposing. The state allows us to apply a minimum number of units. We're not doing that. So somebody could effectively come in with a 2-unit cottage cluster, divide it, and have 2 very similar products to a single detached house. There would be the courtyard requirement and so forth, but still you'd have 2 freestanding units on individual lots. The building industry, we know, is interested in detached plexes, particularly duplexes. And we do want to recognize this. We have reached out to some other jurisdictions, 13 of them so far. 6 of those are allowing detached and 7 are not. And it seems that the direction changes rather frequently lately, so we'll keep checking in with them. Our board chair, though, has directed us to meet the bill's minimum expectations within the state deadline. So this is a bigger topic than we can address today. And we do want to have deeper discussion about it. But our direction to date has been to think about potential for detached plexes with the future ordinance, get at least the minimum stuff that we need to do done with this ordinance for the board direction, and then certainly look into the implications and potential benefits of detached plexes. So we can move on. Another topic we might want to talk about more in the future is public feedback that we've been getting, that we are getting. So I'll just go over outreach very briefly. We did send out public notice, as we always do, to the general and individual list, people who volunteer for that notice. Community participation organizations, the cities, the special districts, and others. We've been actively posting information on social media and getting feedback there. We have web content. We've had an online open house. We've got feedback from that. And we are also now moving into a second wave of outreach that's looking to reach underrepresented groups even better. So we will have more information to discuss, and we do hope to talk about that in a separate meeting as well. So we can move on and then have more questions if you'd like. Any questions?
It's Commissioner Wellner. I think you're on mute.
My list of broad concepts at this point, detached plexes, the same issue relative to the ADUs, that Commissioner Will raised, and then the sidewalk and right-of-way issues. Those are the three that I'm most focused on right now. And so did you say that at our next meeting on March 2nd, you're planning to bring more of a conversation toward that detached duplexes issue, or is that something you need direction on today?
We were suggesting that, but we did want feedback from the Planning Commission as to whether that's the right direction for you.
Okay.
Commissioner Havener?
Just an observation. I see there is one thing that the county government and others didn't forego. And if we want to make middle housing truly affordable, maybe transportation development taxes and SDC should be dropped for these types of applications. End of my comment.
Commissioner Wellner.
And I think it was Suzanne that mentioned that you were going to have a kind of a Q&A response to the questions that I raised. And so I don't want to go through all of my questions today necessarily if you're going to do that. And I just wanted to confirm that was in fact the case.
Yes, we do plan to address that as part of prior to the next meeting and more deeply. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I'll hold off until I get that.
Okay.
Commissioner Havener. Oh, I think you were next. Yes. Oh, Commissioner Potter.
Thank you, Chair Lockwood. I wanted to ask that do we have a requirement for accessibility as in transportation for middle housing? Because as we know that as Washington County severely lacks adequate public transit, like we have almost non-existent public transit. So are we requiring something? Because again, as Commissioner Havener said, that one is dropping those taxes, but are we in talks about transportation as well? Because otherwise, again, we're allowing things, middle housing to be built. But we've not required it. We have not encouraged it. We have not given benefit for it. Plus, we don't have the infrastructure to support it. So, and then if we only have one car on the street for middle housing, then it doesn't adequately, if people, as we know that if people are being pushed to the fringes, they will need multiple cars. And if there's not enough parking, then we keep addressing the issue. If we are saying multiple families, multi-generational families can live together, they will need their own cars. So it just seems that we're not talking about transportation enough.
May I answer just a little bit? Thank you. So as high up as the federal government, there are reports that have been generated about what makes housing expensive, and parking is one of those that is a very high contributor toward cost of housing because it does take up space that then displaces living units and living space that could be built. And so the state has limited what we can require, and we are requiring the most that the state allows us to require. It is off-street, but a developer, a builder, or homeowner can provide more than what we require, and there would additionally be off-street space, but we're not requiring any certain number of off-street spaces. I'm sorry, on-street spaces. And then transportation, that's an issue that's bigger than just middle housing, and we are always working on transportation planning improvements, but not something that's covered under this bill, particularly middle housing.
And I think that what we're doing is we are still creating a problem because we'll encourage it, but we are not talking about accessibility to it and the circumstances. It doesn't matter whether it reduces the space or whatever that the state says or the government. I forgot the sentence that you used. But if we do not have enough transit to middle housing, it doesn't address the issue, because people will build the units, and then what do you do about the cars if there is no public transit? So we can't do one thing and not do the other thing that actually ensures it. We can have food, we can have schools, we can have shops, we can have everything. But if we don't provide accessibility, all of that goes down the drain. So I don't think this is addressing the ability to actually live in middle housing.
Well, I appreciate your input. This is only limited to the Community Development Code, and I'm aware that there are transit improvements coming out to Washington County on the existing, on TriMet right now, on the light rail line. But that's not something that we in long range planning, it's not in our wheelhouse. That is TriMet. And certainly we coordinate with them in terms of land use planning. But we only have so many tools to work with here.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, I'm going to take another 10 seconds. It's frustrating because I'm seeing the inadequacies. I am seeing the inequity. I'm seeing the problems that will come up. And it's like, yes, we're doing land use. We are talking about rules and policies and all of it, but we are not talking about what will truly make it affordable, accessible, and usable.
Commissioner Will.
Thank you. I appreciate Commissioner Potter's bringing up public transit as a need, and I want to say that I'm excited about, particularly in existing neighborhoods, the middle housing will add density and add residents in those communities. And hopefully the service that does exist in the communities, which maybe one empty bus passes by every hour, with the higher densities and the more people living there might be enough capacity to meet some of those concerns of Commissioner Potter by having enough people living in the area to warrant a bus stop or the bus line to come more frequently. So, but I also wanted to answer the staff's question about other issues of concern. And I think Commissioner Wellner mentioned one issue in his letter, which might slip through the cracks, and that's related to side setbacks for buildings. I think that what's proposed by staff currently talks about a 5-foot side yard setback. I know there's a higher a greater setback dimension required for street side yards. And I would like staff to talk a little bit about perhaps, and I guess this kind of also goes back to the detached versus attached plex requirements or townhouse requirements, but perhaps we could propose or discuss the option of having interior side backs have a different setback from exterior. So if you have a parent lot and you propose to build, a clustered housing, that maybe the exterior setback would be the 5 feet the staff is suggesting, but maybe some of the interior setbacks would simply have to meet fire code, like 3 feet or 6 feet between buildings or whatever that minimum is.
So that is what we are allowing.
Oh yeah.
That is
maybe I just need to get it pointed out to me, but I didn't see that. And so that was one concern.
Yes, we are allowing in the 2 districts that require 5 feet side yards for a single detached, we're allowing reductions to 3 feet, just like we do in higher districts on the internal side yards, not on the ones abutting offsite property or street sides.
So, but that's not in all districts, that's only in.
Currently, it's 2 districts that don't allow it, and we're proposing to allow it in those districts as well. So it will be allowed in all of them.
So I'm wondering, am I interrupting you? No? Okay, good. I'm wondering if we can, if any of this discussion can be saved for after our public hearing. Would that work for people to save this? I don't know, Mr.
I agree.
Okay, good. Commissioner Podar? Yeah.
In fact, I really did want to bring up, see, when we are talking about these things, the community is listening. If they are, I really hope they are. But they can talk about these issues that we are bringing up, because it was mentioned that if we build density, then probably the transit will follow. That's actually untrue. I have lived on Cornelius Pass for 20 years. Cornelius Pass has become extremely dense. We have lots of townhouses, we have lots of homes, we have all sorts of, we have businesses, business parks, storage units. We have Fred Meyer from TV Highway. It connects all the way to US 30, which has, I don't know how many thousands and thousands of cars going every day. The public transit has not followed. So that's just, if we are not talking about cars and parking, and we're not talking about public transit while talking about housing, we are hoping that things will be done right. They're not being done right. We cannot wait. We are allowing for things, but we're not talking about the reality of it. So it misses the mark of what we are trying to achieve. What is our goal? What is the county's goal? Just to make laws to allow things, or to actually make sure that the county is livable and accessible? So I hope the community is listening and that they talk about it, they give testimonies, they request for it to be a requirement. We cannot have one car in middle housing where there are 2 units or 3 units or 4 units. So it just feels it's missing where it needs to be. Thanks. I'm done.
All right, at this point, I would like to open the public hearing. Do we have Mr. McKinster?
We do. He is unmuted.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair Lockwood. For the record, this is Ryan McKinster. I'm the Director of Policy and Government Affairs for the Home Builders Association of Metro Portland, and I appreciate this opportunity to speak to all of you. First, I want to thank Andy, Teresa, Ann, and everybody that's worked so diligently on this. I know it's a heavy lift. This is not the first commission or committee that I've addressed on this issue. So I really appreciate all the hard work that has gone into it and the discussion that you guys have had tonight. I think you, Ms. Kelly, many of her comments have kind of hit on some of my concerns or some of the issues that we are looking for as we move forward with this, and I appreciate that. One of the main ones would be addressing the issue of detached plexes in the areas that are going to be allowing middle housing. So I'm definitely happy to hear that is under consideration for further review. I encourage you to seriously look at that as we start to build out these units. There is a desire among homeowners or people in the market to purchase 4 detached units rather than attached. And if we look at the regional housing needs analysis that was put out by the state of Oregon a couple of years ago, it shows about 40% of the needed housing going forward would be detached, with only 8% being attached. So just to align with that, we do know there is some research out there that supports that look at detached housing. In addition, I just want to highlight one other issue, that mainly being the requirement for sidewalks. I understand, as Ms. Kelly stated, there is a desire by the community to have, to address gaps in sidewalks or to have consistency in sidewalks, but that is a community desire. One of the intents of this legislation, HB 2001, as well as SB 458, is to create more opportunity for middle housing and hopefully at a lower cost point, although that's not exclusive to the product type. That can also be achieved by creating more units overall to address the severe deficit we have in the greater Portland metro area. However, requiring sidewalks and putting the full cost of the sidewalk development or creation on these middle housing types does add to the cost of the house. Just to make an example, assuming a duplex on a 50 foot frontage lot, you can assume it probably would be about $6,000 for that sidewalk. You split that between two units, that's $3,000 a piece. According to a study by NHB last year, that would price out almost 3,000 people in the greater Portland metropolitan area for those units. So just want to give you some color and some, an example around that as you have a discussion around sidewalk requirements. But with the intent of this legislation, in addition to creating more units, housing affordability is the ultimate goal. And we feel this falls kind of in the face of that desire. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else signed up?
We do not, and nobody has their hand raised.
Okay, then let's move on to any further questions for staff. Any more discussion? Oh, thank you, Jeff. The public hearing is closed. So further questions or discussion? Mr. Back, I think you were wanting to say something earlier, so please go ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to comment on Commissioner Podar's statements, and this is really why you are here. It's to do the balancing act of what's being proposed in the ordinance, and you're going to have questions about parking more or less. You're going to have questions about sidewalks more or less, and you're going to have questions about SDCs and TDT. And depending on where you come down in this balancing act, either it marginally adds costs or decreased costs for these transportation things. So I think all the discussion was really good, but that's ultimately where you have to kind of sort it out yourselves in terms of what you think is more important and where the priorities lie. So the transportation question, we certainly haven't got a complete road network and or transit system out there, and I don't know any place in the world that has entirely built a system prior to having any development happen. So there's always this balance of how much do you allow when, and so that's part of the questions that you're going to have to sort out here in the next month or so.
Commissioner Will, I think you were next on that.
Thank you. I had a question, but I think I actually my memory came back to me and it was answered. The public comment talked about a study that said detached housing is highly desired, and I was going to ask. Somebody before mentioned if the staff have reached out to the building community, and I believe that was a representative from the building community. But I think so we could opportunity to ask them, hey, do you guys prefer what was discussed, having middle housing be allowed to be detached as well as attached? And I think that question was answered. Maybe I just highlight that that we got some feedback tonight from the building community, and that was their stance.
Commissioner Petrillo.
You know, I have a lot to say, but I'm not going to, because there's 4 or 5 of us that are talking the most. And I would like to hear from other commissioners. I mean, I do want to hear from the professionals, obviously, who work in the field here. But I also, Commissioner Milliman, Commissioner Havener, Vice Chair Dye, this is kind of some of us who are talking about it, I don't want us to be taking up all the oxygen in the room. If you have, I'd like to hear some other opinions or voices.
Shall we let Commissioner Wellner make his comment and then, yes, open it to other voices? Please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think I was one of the people Jeff was referring to. I apologize. But I wanted to just make sure. So I know we closed the public hearing. I wanted to make sure that, we've got at least 2 more meetings potentially, and a third potentially. I was just verifying that we were going to open up the public hearing at least 1 or 2 more of those meetings. Obviously, we don't have a whole lot of participation here today, but maybe we will at the next meeting. Is that a possibility, Ms. Chair?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Anyone else have comments or questions at this point? Commissioner Havener.
Just to address Commissioner Petrillo's desire to hear from others, you don't have to talk a lot to be heard.
Thank you. My problem.
Commissioner Milliman.
I guess I just kind of wanted to volunteer what I'm thinking through, which is figuring out how much decision-making authority we really have. Like, a lot of this seems decided and informational. So I appreciate some of the folks that have been on here longer pointing out where we can make a difference and what is different between the model we're being offered by the state and the one we're trying to build. So, yeah, lots to absorb.
Commissioner Petrillo.
Well, I'd like to respond to that. I think that's a really good question, something that every new planning commissioner asks themselves from day one until the day they go off is, the longer you're on serving the commission, I think the more, and depending on what the boards, the board of commissioners interest is, I think what they've said is multiple times they are really interested in what we have to offer, and when we recommend something that has actually been in contravening what staff has recommended, they have taken that into consideration and sometimes have adopted it. So let me for example, Commissioner Havener said something that I've been thinking about, which was, why aren't we thinking about being more proactive and saying maybe we need to create incentives here by dropping fees, or we did this once before in a way that I didn't think was necessary, but the prior board did it with the transportation development tax, whatever it's called, when we hit the Great Recession, and said, hey, let's not cripple our let's give a break to our home builders because of the crisis that we were in. It's a different type of crisis, right? It was a real estate crisis I was been thinking about that, and Commissioner Havener brought it right up, and we're in a different crisis now. We are in I don't know what it is. Some people are attracted to real estate and housing and, community development issues. And I've always been that person. I've been doing it for 30, 40 years, right? I've never seen a housing market this constrained and distorted in terms of both the rental market and the single family market, or the housing market, the home ownership market. I knew it was bad. I read the statistics. I just looked at on Zillow right now. Zillow does great data research. They have a whole team of people. 7 of their research headlines are about the astounding appreciation that's been going on for the last 2 years, since the pandemic, but even before that to some extent. And I have a 20-year-olds at home. I want them out of the house. I haven't had any success. One is because I think they like being home, which is great. But so we've been touring houses, and I don't mean to make the fallacy of generalizing my specific experience, but I'm going there, and it's like there's a house goes on a market, and it is basically if it's not sold in 48 hours, something's wrong with the house. And not just that, the realtors are telling me, and I've been seeing it, that people are getting, houses just get bid up from the list price, and they're getting bid up with multiple offers. Basically, it's like it's an auction. This is not like an isolated situation in one part of the county. It's happening throughout the county. And we are at a generational historic housing problem. And it's not discussed enough. And I think for the first time I've heard the Homebuilders Association, I really appreciated Ryan's letter. He highlights several of the issues, and one of them is this crisis, and that when we think about sidewalk connections and we think about other things that we'd like to see goals and to accomplish with this, we also have to realize that right now we need to be recognizing this is not a normal market, and it's not going to normalize like in a year. It's there's a fundamental problem going on that's going to take supply, and we can't develop supply unless we create incentives. What if every home builder who is out there trying to do something like, hey, did you hear about Washington County creating these incentives for middle housing? And, that's what we need, not like, oh, yeah, well, they did middle housing, but, they laid on all these restrictions. And then I was like to my daughter, I said, okay, well, look, maybe you need to wait for the market to cool off. So I told her to look at the rental market. We did a Craigslist search, 2 bedrooms in Washington County. We couldn't find, it was basically $1,400 to $1,500. Rents have gone up just as much as how home prices have. This middle housing ordinance opportunity, it could help if we focused or was very proactive in this way. And then my last point is, again, Ryan, who's my new best friend now, even though I've never really liked the Home Builders Association, I felt they were a self-serving organization serving their own industry in their own pocketbook. But I see that the interests are aligning, and that what Ryan said also was correct. That we need to be creating more supply and more incentives, and so I hope. And as he said, this is the most momentous piece of legislation in land use in Oregon since SB 100, and we're not going to get it completely right. It's going to need to be amended over time. So we don't need to make it perfect, but I think right now we need to be creative and create incentives. That's enough talking.
Commissioner Porter.
Commissioner Petro, to piggyback on that, but we are again talking about incentive to the builder and to the property owners. $787 million worth of housing was bought by Wall Street investors. 74% of single family homes are bought by investors. So it just seems that we're not going to address who's having access to this. We are not giving the benefit to the people who need housing. We are talking about benefit. I'm only talking about benefits to builders and property owners, not to the people. We as a county, as land use commission, are missing the people that need access to homes, completely missing it. And we are not doing enough. I don't know why we are. When is the time that we are going to start truly being, that we are going to start including the people that need this? I don't know where it's going to take. Is it going to take talking to commissioners? Is it going to take talking to state? To whom is it going to take that we can address all of this? It's very frustrating. Honestly, it's very frustrating to talk about middle housing and not talk about the community that needs it.
Commissioner Wellner.
Just a quick comment. It's important to know that in other parts of the country, housing is a heck of a lot more affordable. And the reason for that, part of the reason for it is all of the policies that we have as a region have created over the last 30 years, whether it's a constrained land supply or figuring out how to pay for roads and just jacking SDCs up and not figuring out how to pay for things community-wide, or a new code section in order to address a one-off problem, or the addition of month after month after month of process and multiple touch points for every project. We're a big reason for why housing is expensive here, because it takes so long to deliver it. And the process is so slow, and it becomes more and more slow every year. And I've been doing this for 25 years, and I mean, with the last 2 years in particular, it's gotten just exponentially slower. So if we did our best to just get out of the way, then housing is going to become more available and inherently less expensive. It happens in other parts of the country. And it happens just because it's more available in other parts of the country. That's the real reason. So, yeah, I think we need to do more to make housing more affordable to everybody. But the first place to fix the problem is to fix the out of balance market, which is exactly what we have.
Commissioner Will.
Thank you, Chair. I want to remind us all to make sure that we remember that some people need to rent housing because they're not ready to commit to a purchase. I appreciate Commissioner Podar's concerns about monopoly of ownership and sort of a landlord culture where people are slaves to their landlord or unable to purchase land because it's all bought by somebody else. But I want us to remember that not everybody is ready to purchase. And so landlords do serve a purpose in our society to serve those who need to rent or want to rent, or maybe they're going to move in 2 years and they're not ready for that commitment. And I want to make sure that if you think about our zoning code, if the minimum lot area for a division is a 5,000 square foot lot, and somebody owns a 9,000 square foot lot, they currently cannot divide the lot into two lots. So they cannot create a second dwelling unit, a second lot with a single family or townhouse second lot, because their lot's just not big enough. And middle housing that allows them to do that. And when they do that, will create a second home, whether they keep that second home for themselves and rent it, or whether they sell that to somebody else to own. This middle housing is going to basically serve our community, and we want to make sure that we encourage that. one of the things I'm concerned about is somebody who owns that 9,000 square foot lot and could not divide it and had an ADU built on the back, so they could maybe in the backyard they could rent the ADU to a college student or something. And our current text here we're proposing in this ordinance would not allow them to turn their primary dwelling into a duplex, because the ADU is counted as a residence when so you'd have to tear down the ADU. So I want to make sure as we move forward in our discussions and staff helps us understand our options, that little things like that don't discourage somebody who has a very large lot and they want to build a duplex, but they can't because the way we wrote the code says that they're not allowed to. Even though there's plenty of room on their lot to build a duplex, they can't because the ADU is already built. And so I really think that when we talk about incentives or versus requirements, this has been brought up a couple times during this meeting, that middle housing is going to be the greatest incentive for existing lots, I believe, is my opinion. And we can't require somebody who owns a 9,000 square foot lot and a house to divide it. We can't require somebody to build an ADU. We can't require somebody to take their primary dwelling and turn it into a duplex. But we can incentivize them simply by making it legal. And I appreciate, it's the desire to require higher densities or require more development that may be appropriate in greenfield development where we require higher densities. But this middle housing is going to achieve the greatest effect by incentivizing people to do what they've always wanted to do, which is divide their land, but they weren't allowed to, or build that duplex unit off the side of their yard, which they weren't allowed to do because they'd exceed the minimum densities. So I want us to keep remembering that as we look at these elements and say, well, what would a typical lot, how would that affect a typical lot? If they wanted to build a threeplex, can they? So I just want to make that comment. Thank you.
Commissioner Wellner. You're on mute.
I think what we're trying to accomplish tonight is to give staff direction on the things we should be talking about in the next two meetings. And I don't know that, I'm just speaking my mind. I don't know that we're going to be able to accomplish much more than that, because until we have real conversations informed by staff's responses to the questions they've received and or some more analysis of the specific items that we give them direction on discussing, there's not a whole lot more for us to accomplish tonight, I don't think. So I guess I'll just, the four primary issues that I see as those that we're going to have to work through outside of the larger policy related issues, but the four primary issues that were written into this code, I saw are the sidewalk and right-of-way issue, the allowances for detached housing, the ADU piece, and then the last addition I had to that is the design requirements and getting some more clarity on what those are and how they can really be implemented and how difficult they may be to implement or not. So I think that would be another good item to make part of our conversations to help us get to a well-rounded ordinance in the end. It may also be beneficial if we are able to get to a conclusion in the next two meetings to still utilize that end of March meeting to make some further recommendations to the board about other things to think about those higher level policy issues that we're all talking about here and now. And so it may be that we've already made our recommendation, but we've got some other things to talk about afterwards that would also be helpful to the board.
Okay.
Commissioner, Petrillo.
Yeah, I just want to try to move it along because I'm, I complimenting this is complementary to what Matt's saying. So I think really everything that was outlined in the HBA article made perfect sense to me. So I want staff to know that I don't think this is just an industry representative saying, please do this for us, give us some freebies or easy ways to do it. I think all of it except for one or two, which was the design piece. Fenestration, glazing, whatever you want to call it, aesthetic, streetscape is important. And minimum design standards might be very. When it comes to fenestration, I think it's that's a value add in my point. But everything else that they mentioned, which was almost what Matt said, with the exception of the ADUs, I thought that the HBA letter was well written, balanced, and I would use it as a guide for ways to improve of this moving forward.
I guess I would just add, since we've mentioned maybe the 30th, maybe staff could send out a poll and we'd find out availability of PC members for either afternoon or evening on the 30th. And Vice Chair Dye, you fleetingly had your hand up. Did you want to make a comment?
I don't want to delay the night much further, but I did want to just say a couple of thoughts. And first and foremost, I'm sorry that I was double booked tonight, and I tried my best to be in many places. So please forgive the early absence. But I do want to just applaud the types of conversations that we're having that really have taken a realistic look at the impact of affordability and what this has done to our community. And it's nice that people are asking for some type of solution. And, so for those of us who are not, direct housing experts, we are representative of a community that is struggling to find affordable housing. And, we're hoping for some type of solution that we can look at and say we accomplished something. And I appreciate the commissioner, recognizing that this may, what we pass initially is probably going to have to be tweaked and revised, and we will have to refine it later on. But we should be doing something, that is a somewhat of a beacon that says that we are listening, hearing, and acknowledging that there's an issue. And we're doing our best to resolve that. And I think that, the court of public opinion would, at least see that there's good intention in our work. And, I am, I guess I would like to, just revisit a comment I've made probably some meetings ago, but I would love to see why or how the, Washington County can look at a homestead exemption for people who are, living in their homes as a way to, spur on affordability. And I don't want to, discount Commissioner Podar's observation of the amount of multi-home ownership that's there, but I've lived in communities where there has been homesteading, and I've seen what it does to help people who can get on the first rung of home ownership just by having a decreased tax burden for X number of years that they actually live in the home, and how much of a difference that can make in helping people get in the door. And I know that, statewide, the program, that I haven't seen exist, but maybe at the county level, we can, take that initial step forward and say, we're going to try this and see if we can do this. And I think ultimately, as the staff hears what we're saying, it'd be nice, that they come back with and say, well, this is what we can do. Yes. But, we're going to be aggressive, and we're going to be, we're going to do our best to try to be pioneers in this space. And we're going to offer this up as a suggestion because, we are in a place where, just like the number of examples that we've heard already, so many people are priced out of that first rung. We are certainly going to become a multi-tiered society where some people will never have the joy of home ownership because it is completely out of reach. I am just disturbed by the amount of homes that I'm seeing that are going more than $100,000 over asking price. The number of complete cash transactions that we're seeing in our community that are making it that much more difficult for families, families with children and working class families to get home ownership. So, we're going to have to find a way to be creative in the face of higher interest rates, higher building costs, higher materials costs, higher labor costs, understanding that the price of housing is not going to be able to go down. But if we can provide some solution that can help mitigate some of the escalation of cost, then I think that we've done a service to the people that we're representing tonight. So I do appreciate that all the commissioners are having very thoughtful conversations around what we can do. And I just want the staff to push a little harder to do something, even more creative, to say that, we're going to make this one extra effort to try to build affordability into the middle housing that we come up with.
Mr. Beck.
I just wanted to kind of jump on what Commissioner Wellner was saying, and in fact, everyone has sort of hinted at this, that when you get close to the end of making a recommendation on middle housing, also have this side list of, we know we haven't done everything with middle housing. Here are all the other things that the county should be focusing on with regard to housing. I think that would be a really good benefit for the board, and it's just a practical thing to do, that you're going to focus a lot, and you've thought a lot about housing over the past 6 months, and so that seems like a perfect time to kind of create that wish list, or whatever you want to call it, of other things that need to be done. So I'd encourage, as we get near the end, to have some time to do that, and maybe it means coming back at another meeting to do that. So I just want to throw that out there.
I would agree. And Chair Lockwood, could I just say one more thing?
Sure, go ahead.
I just, we're getting close to finishing and then the rest of the agenda, but, there's a lot riding on middle housing to me. I take it personally. I have 4 sets of grandparents from Italy that came here through Ellis Island. They settled in the Northeast in basically what was middle housing. 3 and 4 story, 3 and 4 family houses, row houses, and it provided safe and affordable housing for them. It also created community because it was densely packed, and I think there's a social good here that we just have to keep in mind, and that is that it's going to create more social good and community benefit than we probably recognize. I think one of the problems that we face, my earlier generations of my family had, that I don't have, and that my generation doesn't have, is that we are more disconnected, and I think loneliness is one of the biggest problems we have in this country, and the way we live among each other, and even in the space. Middle housing, if you're able to have your relatives, your mother-in-law, a child with a single parent with it, it creates. There's a lot. I think there's a lot more writing on this than just simply the land use technicality, and so I think we have to keep that in mind.
Me too. Any other comments? Well, then I think we probably are ready to end that discussion for tonight. We'll be addressing it again at our next meeting. The next item on the agenda is Planning Commission communications. Is there any commissioner who wants to say something to us tonight on a different topic? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands, so I think we can move on. And the item after that is adjourn. So I propose that, having finished our discussion, we adjourn for tonight. Is there any objection? Seeing none, we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.